Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler for you, and today I want to talk about my testimony. But before I can do that, I need to explain what I mean by my testimony, as it is a piece of Christian jargon. So when Christians talk about their testimony, what they're usually referring to is their conversion experience or why they're a Christian, why they became a Christian. For a long time I didn't really think that I had much to say here, because my experience wasn't what you'd call dramatic, in terms of what I usually think of as a testimony. I grew up in a Christian home and decided this made sense to me. I'll touch on that briefly later, but that was kind of it, right? It decided it made sense to me, and it continues to do so, and that was sort of my experience, and I didn't feel like there was a whole lot to say there. It wasn't dramatic or flashy or exciting. It wasn't in the mold of, say, Saul, who became Paul. It wasn't in the mold of C.S. Lewis, whose investigations to try to disprove Christianity convinced him of its truth. It wasn't some sort of dramatic conversion experience. But then I realized that looking at it this way sort of sells the conversion experience short. And I mean short literally, in that conversion is a process. It doesn't just happen overnight. Sometimes there's an accelerated start, and we tend to find those accelerated starts very exciting, very dramatic. And that's what we tend to talk about when we talk about testimony. But the purpose of sharing a testimony is to describe God's working. That's kind of the idea. So I realized that I have a lot more to share than I originally thought. There's a lot more to my testimony than I had originally conceived. It's more complicated, more nuanced. But before I kind of delve into some of that, I do want to, as I mentioned earlier, touch a bit on why I'm a Christian in a general sort of sense. And like I said, it makes sense to me. Basically, what we're looking at when we look at faith systems or belief systems, or to some extent a how are we here explanations, there's a number of different competing ideas. There's a variety of religions that all have different various stories for it. And then there's also sort of the secular view of however they're saying the universe happens to exist, and however they're trying to claim life began. And then you have evolution to explain speciation and different types of life. And I've always felt that a lot of those require a greater stretch of faith than believing in a supertemporal, almighty creator God who has a personality and all of that sort of stuff. Now, you might have a different opinion on that, but I've just found sort of almost the belief in randomness that somehow, against all that we know about the laws of entropy and all of that sort of stuff, the most complex molecule we know came into existence, against what we know about life having come from life. Somehow something defied that, and life began and then managed to survive. That seems to me far less likely. Where do you get sexes from? From something that learns how to reproduce, cellular division. How do you get to having sexes? Why aren't there more monosexed? Monosex is maybe not the right word, but basically monosex species, like it's common in plants where they have the ability to reproduce with any other plant, right? Why don't we have more monosex species where it's like it can reproduce with any other member of a species? That would seem more stable. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off into the weeds there. But there's just a lot of stuff where it's like, where did something come from? Something has to come from something. Something doesn't just come from nothing. And maybe you can come up with reasons why that would be, but I've always felt that those are more of a stretch of faith than a supertemporal God that's always existed because he's beyond time, above time, greater than time, as it were. That's what I mean by supertemporal. And I have a whole Rambler on that called The Time Problem that you can go look up and listen to if you want to. But anyway, so I felt that the sort of Christian God made more sense. So when we begin with things, my story is one of what I would describe as God's faithfulness. So we begin with me being born into a Christian family. This is in the United States of America at that. Like, none of us have any control over to whom we are born. And if I believe in the sovereignty of God as I do, then I believe that God chose me to be born to the parents to which I was born. And that is kind of where we start. I was in a Christian home, learned Christian ideas, but I didn't just learn a cultural Christianity. When I say Christian home, I don't mean a home that's just Christian because that's what we've always been. I mean a home wherein there's decided decisions, particularly with my mom, especially at some of that time, about choosing to be Christian and wanting to explain that stuff to me as well. some of that is more her story to tell than mine. But it's one of those things where that's where we start. And what I then look at over my life is how I have changed, right? If we're talking about the testimonies being a conversion experience, then we need to go and see, what was I converted from? And this is always how it's presented. It's presented as a contrast, the testimonies are, of who were we and who did we become. So I'm going to talk about some of who I have been and who I'm trying to not be and who I am trying to be, as it were. So some of this is going to be very personal, and some of it's going to be stuff I haven't necessarily talked about a whole lot. But it's important, I think, to share and to understand, because I don't think most people's conversion experience ends at the moment they become baptized. I think it begins before that and ends at their deathbed. So if we go ahead and start early on, who was I? Well, I was cruel. I haven't really talked about this, but at one point in time, when I was riding the school bus, probably like kindergarten, first grade, something like that. I don't remember exactly what sort of age. I just know that I was young. I was definitely a bully. I had a kid that I liked to sit next to on the bus and beat up, like physically beat up. And I don't talk about this because I don't like thinking about it. I don't like who that person was. But that was me at one point in time. And I've always had very strong, Schadenfreude, I think is the German term, enjoyment at others' pain. And I don't like that. And I try to, these days, overcome that with a desire to be empathetic. I don't feel like I'm naturally a very empathetic person. I don't naturally have a lot of empathy. I've had to train myself in it, or been trained in it, however you want to kind of phrase it. And I can see at those very beginnings that I was likely to be destined to be a very cruel person had things not taught me otherwise. That's an earlier time. I was also very possessive and kind of vindictive. I remember when a friend accidentally broke or bent or something, a Lego thing, and I demanded restitution for that. I wasn't forgiving at all. This would have been something closer to like 11, 12 years old, something like that. I have had to kind of overcome some of that, learn to be forgiving. I've had manipulation streak as well, where I've had tendency to be very manipulative. I remember an instance with a roommate who was going through some stuff, and even in the midst of that, and this was in college even, like after I was baptized and all of that, but it's still part of the conversion experience, as stuff gets brought to the fore that needs to be dealt with. And I was manipulative of that person for trying to kind of get financial gain for myself to some extent. Not a whole lot either, but it was wrong of me. And I'm sorry about it now, and I see and can recognize this thing, and I can try to work against it. And I had a lot of lust issues also in college that I had to confront, that I had to deal with. I'll talk about those more in a specific podcast for them. You can read about them. I'll try to link to an article that I wrote sometime a bit afterwards that's up on my blog that I don't really use very much because I'm doing Ramblers now. But that was a difficult time, and I had to overcome that. And I want to do, like I said, a follow-up Rambler on it because it deserves its own thing. That's going to be scheduled for later. And then I also had to overcome sort of trying to, I'm not even quite sure the right phrase, but it was brought to my attention through some conflict with one of the guys at Vernacular Games that I was talking to, that I was communicating to try to prove how clever I was. When I opened my mouth, I wasn't trying to do it to communicate. I was trying to do it to prove something about myself. And I had a very stark moment with him, and that's changed how I approach communication. It's made me intentional. It opened my eyes. I've had moments like this, like with the lust moment, where God opened my eyes and said, this isn't what you want to be. And I've learned a lot about what lust is since then. And it has been... It's been a struggle because there's been a lot of bad education I've received on it. But again, I'll talk about that more on the Rambler for that. So this is kind of bringing us up to the present day. Like the communication thing was a few years ago now, but not that long ago. And even just recently, part of what inspired this was further sort of part of this whole conversion process. One of the things that I've struggled with is feeling less holy or righteous or whatever than other people that I see. And less worthy somehow. And I was confronted with it very powerfully in a Bible study that I did. And it made me have to confront and come face to face with this idea that was wrong, that flew in the face of what I knew, but my heart believed something erroneous. And I had continued conversion there of saying, no, God has made me for a purpose. That purpose is worthy, worthwhile. He's made me for it. The things that he's given me to do are worth doing. And that was something that I knew but didn't believe, and I needed to believe it. And that's part of why I'm telling you this now, this testimony now, because it has been a conversion process, dramatic conversion process. There has been a lot of change that's had to happen in my life, a lot of change of who I was. And it's been a process. It hasn't been some sort of dramatic overnight switch. It's been the effects of seeking God and him changing me in that process, of me disowning that fallen person who I was and being replaced by the new creation that God has made. So I am not who I was, and I'm not on the path that I would have been. I don't like to think about who that person was. I don't like to go into that mental space of who that alternate Sientir would have been. That cruel, manipulative, lustful, self-boasting person seeking flattery, seeking praise. That's one of the things I still struggle with, is wanting recognition for everything that I do. And not being, I don't know, it's part of, it goes into some of that being happy to do things for the Lord sort of stuff, and working for the Lord. So this is my testimony, at least up to this point. And in years to come, there will be more testimony. There's one more thing that I think that I should add, though, which has been a very interesting experience. You can choose to believe me on it or not. But it's been some very unusual dreams that I've had. The one that always stands out in my mind is a dream that I had in 6th grade when I was standing in the lunch line. This was my dream. I was standing in the lunch line, waiting to get lunch in the cafeteria of my middle school. Now, this wasn't going to happen because I had study hall the period before lunch, and we always released early, so I was never waiting in line. And then I had an experience in 7th grade where I didn't have study hall, where I was standing in line, and it was that exact moment in the dream the prior school year. It was a prophetic dream, and I've had a few since then. I don't know why, but I feel that these are also important to include in this. There's one that I remember where I was sitting in the car with my mom as we were driving on a local road, and in the dream I mentioned to her that I dreamed about it, and that scenario played out. Those are some that I remember, and there have been others, usually small moments, usually mundane moments, nothing particularly exciting, but just the mundane parts of life. It's interesting, and I don't have any explanation for it beyond God is sovereign and has a purpose for them. But I think that it's important to share that as well. Like I said, believe me if you want to, or don't if you don't want to. But I think that this kind of concludes what I have to say on this for now. There will be more later, because, like I said, I think the whole of one's life is one's testimony. The whole of one's life is the conversion experience. That which Christians call sanctification, of being changed, transformed. So until next time, everyone, think about who you could have been and who you're not. What conscious decisions you've made, what we'd call revelation, has happened to turn the course of your life. And consider what might be happening in your own life. You can contact me directly at sientir@gmail.com. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/sientirsramblers. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Sientir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.